It's a pleasure to be here with you all once again. As we come to the beginning of a brand new year, many people are filled with hope that things will be better in 2021 than they were in 2020. But there are also many people who are very afraid of what's to come possibly in the year 2021. And what we have to realize is that the fears that we have can actually be used against us. And so the title of our subject today is going to be the weaponization of that fear. One thing that we all know from history, we all might be familiar with this quote, and that is that FDR once said, "The only thing that we have to fear is fear itself." Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great writer and poet, he said, "Fear defeats more people than any other thing, than any one thing in the world." And why is that? The reason why is because fear is incredibly dangerous. Why is that? Because fear brings out the absolute worst in people. Fear turns normal, sane, rational human beings into wild animals. It makes intelligent, logical, rational people do irrational things. One of my favorite historical books, it's called The Great Controversy. And on page 32, it actually talks about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD. And as it describes the scenes that took place within the city of Jerusalem, it's absolutely horrifying. It says that natural affection seemed to have been destroyed. Husbands robbed their wives and wives their husbands. Children would be seen snatching the food from the mouths of their aged parents. In other words, what happened was fear made people lose their minds and behave like selfish animals. Now, how is fear weaponized? How are our own fears turned against us? That's a very important question that we should all be asking so that we are not susceptible, or at least less susceptible, to the tactics that are used by certain very powerful people. Rahm Emanuel, he used to be Barack Obama's chief of staff, and then he went on to be the mayor of Chicago. He once said, "You never want a serious crisis to go to waste." And what I mean by that is that it's an opportunity to do things that you could not do before. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, in the 19th century, there was a German philosopher by the name of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And he created a concept that we know today as the Hegelian dialectic. And what that is it's a philosophy, and it can be simplified in sort of common day vernacular by saying problem, reaction, solution. I have an article here that really sort of breaks it down, and it says, problem solving is an essential human activity, for without it, there can be no innovation, development, or even enrichment in the quality of this experience known as life. There are a whole host of troubles that exist, ranging from the mundane to the grave. Some will always be with us. Others will simply change and morph into something similar. With all the genuine challenges we face, conjuring artificial difficulties out of whole cloth is clearly not only a great crime, but also dishonestly attempts to reprioritize what truly matters. Now, that might sound a little bit overwhelming in terms of information, but what the article here is saying is that George William Friedrich Hegel's Hegelian dialectic, or problem, reaction, solution, simply put, is a very powerful manipulation technique. It's a technique you can not only create a massive paradigm shift, not just in individuals, but in entire societies as well. And so what this tool that they use, this paradigm shift that they're using, or that they're hoping to get out of individuals and out of entire societies, can only be driven by using the fuel of fear. So when I said that fear can be weaponized, this is how. When a group of powerful individuals want to move sort of a whole mass of people towards a predetermined outcome, all that they need to do is basically hit a few key notes to kind of ratchet up the fear. and then boom, right? Panic, fear, hysteria come, and that leads to acquiescence, capitulation, and almost begging for the powers that be to stop that fearful thing from happening. And as political leaders, they'll promise to do that, of course, right? Because that's what, our loving political leaders do, but it always comes with strings attached. Perfect example. In the year 2001, on September 11th, the United States experienced a horrific terrorist attack that killed over 3,000 people at the World Trade Center in Manhattan. And before that time, life was very different. But immediately after that, I would say within a matter of weeks, there was something that was rolled out, and I don't know how they got it out so fast, but it was created. It was called the Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act was something that stripped away many of the freedoms and the rights that we hold dear as American people. But people were so afraid because of that terrorist attack that occurred on 9/11 that they gleefully, willingly gave up these precious, long held freedoms in exchange for security. And so that's kind of how problem reaction solution works, is that when something occurs, whether this was an actual organic event or something that was maybe a false flag event, you can take advantage of that to do things and get things done that you couldn't before, because the people, the masses, their mindset is going to be in a different place. And that's what Rahm Emanuel meant when he said, you never want a serious crisis to go to waste. And what I mean by that is it's an opportunity to do things that you could not do before. You see, your fear that you have naturally as a result of things that go on in the world can be weaponized against you. If you are not aware and if you are not cognizant of the fact that there are people like what Rahm Emanuel revealed to us who think like this, then you can be taken along and carried away with the tide of fear into doing things that you would have never done before. So how does this work? I'll give you 3 quick steps. Step 1 is you either take advantage of a pre-existing problem, or by making it more atrocious or even worse, or even worse than that, you create an artificial problem. This is what Hitler did with the Reichstag fire, and that's how he was able to gain power and become sort of a dictator in Nazi Germany. The step 2, after you either take advantage of a pre-existing problem by making it more atrocious, or actually go as far as creating the problem yourself, is you then present to the public through, of course, the corporate controlled media, the version of the problem that you want us to hear to elicit a particular response from the population. That's called the narrative, right? Whenever you hear the official story or the narrative, that's what that is. The next step is that the political leaders, the establishment, whoever you're talking about, the powers that be, they offer a prepackaged solution, which was something that they always wanted to do even before the problem had become manifested, but they couldn't get away with it. But because of the problem and because of the fear reaction of the populace, they were then able to weaponize that fear to get capitulation and acquiescence and have you go along with something that you may have never gone along with before. The whole point of the Hegelian dialectic or problem reaction solution is to fundamentally alter society with the least amount of popular opposition possible, basically weakening any form of resistance automatically from the beginning. That's how fear is weaponized. I have this article here, and it's quoting a former commander of chief of the National Socialist Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, and he says, why, of course, the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best he can get out of it is to come back home to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor for that matter in Germany. That is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country that determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along. Whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they're being attacked and denounce the peacemakers for their lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. And obviously, you can substitute war for any sort of artificial problem, and the same principles are still going to apply, right? So essentially, you can get the people to act against their own self-interest by weaponizing the fears that occur as a result of, events or circumstances that occur. And how do they do this? They do this by one of their most powerful tools, and that is the mainstream media. Let's be honest. There are many people here who should have more discernment than you do. People watched CNN and they watch Fox News and they watch MSNBC and they watch or read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or Forbes magazine or any number of mainstream media publications, and they believe what they read because they have been told that these people have credibility. And they dismiss other sources of information because they are not credible. That's what's called argumentum ad hominem. And what that means is you are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You are attacking the information based on the source of the information. You see, this is what in the Bible, when I read the Bible, this is what the Pharisees tried to do to Jesus. They tried to discredit Jesus by saying, well, he didn't go to our schools. He just, we know him. We knew him all his life. He grew up down the street working in his daddy's carpenter shop. Why listen to him? What he's saying is nonsense. It didn't matter whether what he was saying was true, whether it was right. All that mattered is we are the credible people. We are the source of information. We are the trusted source for information and the arbiters of truth. You come to us because you're too stupid to decipher or to discern the difference between lies and falsehoods. So we'll spoon feed you, right? Now, here's the thing. We are all given by God a certain level of intellect. We can look at information for ourselves and make our own determinations. We don't need anybody, regardless of how intelligent they claim to be or how sophisticated they claim to be, to filter truth for us. But that's exactly what happens today. There was a man by the name of John Swinton. He was the preeminent New York journalist, and he was a guest of honor at a banquet given him by the leaders of his craft sometime around 1880. And someone who knew neither the press nor Swinton offered a toast to the independent press, right? And Swinton got up somewhat outraged by his colleague, and he said this. And this was back in the 19th century, 1880s that he said this. He says, "There is no such thing at this state of world's history in America as an independent press. You know it, and I know it. There is not one of you who dares to write your honest opinions. And if you did, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. I am paid weekly for keeping my honest opinion out of the paper I am connected with. Others of you are paid similar salaries for similar things. And of you who would be so foolish as to write honest opinions would be out on the streets looking for another job. If I allowed my honest opinion to appear in one issue of my paper, before 24 hours, my occupation would be gone. The business of the journalist is to destroy the truth, to lie outright, to pervert, to vilify, to fawn at the feet of Mammon, and sell his country and his race for his daily bread. You know it, and I know it. And what folly is this toasting of an independent press? We are the tools and vassals of rich men." Remember I talked about the tools that they use? We are the tools of vassals and rich men behind the scenes. We are the jumping jacks, and they pull the strings. We dance, Our talents, our possibilities, and our lives are all the properties of other men. We are intellectual prostitutes. Now, this was written back in 1880. How much more true is that in the year 2020? Okay. When you read and when you study and you look at things in the media, you have to do so with a great deal of discernment, because in the Bible, there's the Apostle Paul. He once said that the love of money is the root of all evil. And whether you are a Christian or a non-Christian or a believer or a non-believer, many of us can agree that the love of money, above all else, leads to people making some very poor decisions. And sometimes those decisions harm other people as well. So what happens is powerful people use the tool of the mainstream media to peddle fear, to fearmonger, to ratchet up fear. Because if fear can be ratcheted up through a narrative or through quote unquote an official story, then people, the average person, just wants to be safe. They want to be happy. They want to live their life in peace. And if that means, I have to go along with this so you can fix the problem and make the scary thing or the scary country or the scary man go away, then so be it. You see, this is how fear is weaponized. I have an article here. It's from 2017, April 30th, 2017. It's by Scott A. Bond, PhD. And the article is called How and Why Social Elites Manipulate Public Fear. Moral Panic Benefits Its Creators. Look at that title again. How and Why Social Elites Manipulate Public Fear. Moral Panic Benefits Its Creators. So the article says, have you ever wondered what causes mass hysteria? Have you ever considered that widespread public fear can be created and manipulated by powerful interest groups? What did we just talk about? We talked about something called the Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution, wherein somebody takes a pre-existing organic event that is very frightening and uses it for their own purposes, like Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Or even worse, they manufacture the crisis. That's what's called a false flag event. Now, I know for some of you who might be quick to dismiss this as conspiracy, this is absolutely not. We're not talking about conspiracy theories. We're not talking about anything that might be far off in one way or the other. We're talking about actual manipulation techniques that people use psychologically to drag people along to do things that are against their own self-interest. And this is absolute documented fact. You can study this all for yourselves. Nothing that I'm saying here is conspiracy theory or is in any way disputed amongst honest, reputable scientists and psychologists. But the article goes on and says, the sociological concept known as moral panic offers valuable insight into how and why powerful social agents such as the news media and the police deliberately create public concern or fear of an individual or group. If you ever see the media attacking a group of people or an individual incessantly over and over and over and over and over, that should be an alarm sign. That should be a red flag. Something's going on here. And you should be able to lift the veil or read between the lines and try and figure out what's actually happening, right? Because it's more than likely that there's a narrative or there's a goal that they're trying to achieve for their masters, right? It says moral panic has been defined as a situation in which public fears and state interventions greatly exceed the objective threat posed to a society by a particular individual or group who is / are claimed to be responsible for creating that threat in the first place. Let's take a perfect example. This might be a little controversial, but I don't think anybody here is any stranger to controversy. If you've ever turned on a TV within the last couple of months, that's pretty much all you see. But let's take, for example, the coronavirus, the pandemic that's currently going on in the world and in this country. You see lockdown. I live in California, where we have some of the most extreme lockdowns in the country and possibly in the world. And there's curfews going on. Children aren't allowed to attend school in person. And it's because the public has been made very afraid of this disease. And so the state has intervened in a way that many would feel greatly exceed the objective threat posed to society by this particular pandemic. Because what we don't hear often is we don't hear that there is a 99.98% recovery rate. So if you look at it logically, just pragmatically, without any of the fear insinuated into the argument, you might think, well, that's a little extreme to do A, B, C, and D to shut down whole cities. I just read yesterday that San Francisco, California, which is where I was born and raised, is locking down indefinitely. So, this is what happens, right? Okay, let's move on. Here in the article, Scott Bond says, central to the moral panic concept is an argument that public concern or fear over an alleged social problem is mutually beneficial to state officials. Did you hear that? Public concern or fear over an alleged social problem is mutually beneficial to state officials, that is, politicians and law enforcement authorities and the news media. The relationship between state officials and the media is symbiotic in that politicians and law enforcement need communication channels to distribute their rhetoric, and the media needs tantalizing news content to attract a wide audience, which in turn attracts advertisers. Let me break that down. So the powers that be, the state officials, right, law enforcement, want to achieve a certain goal, right? Problem, reaction, solution, the Hegelian dialectic, right? They need the media to act as a megaphone to blast that message out to the public, because they want to create the moral panic or fear that would allow people to hand over rights and allow them to create a circumstance or situation that they wouldn't previously have agreed to. So they need the media. Well, the media knows psychologically that, especially in this country, we are addicted to fear. And we can get into that more another time. But we are absolutely addicted to fear. I am very well connected with people in the Bay Area news media. I'll just say that. And one of the things that I know from the mouth of very high-level producers in these news organizations is that in times past, they have tried to be more positive and have more positive stories, and ratings dip dramatically. They use a saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right? People are so addicted to fear that they give them what they want, essentially. Because, for example, if you look at the teasers that people use as they're going into break, they say, for example, find out what's in your tap water that might be very harmful to you. Now, a rational person is going to want to stick around through the commercial break and whatever the next news stories are to find out exactly what that is, because they don't want to die. See how that works? You see, they made you afraid that there might be something in your water that might kill you, and you stayed glued to your TV watching to find out what that was. So when they peddle the fear, it serves them because the ratings go up, and it serves the state officials and local authorities because they are trying to enact this sort of problem, reaction, solution philosophy. And then the advertisers say, oh, this is great. There's more eyeballs here. I don't care why, but there's more eyeballs here. So we're going to go ahead and pay money to advertise on this particular channel during this program. And that's why. As a matter of fact, CNN, their ratings have been pretty high over the last 4 years. They've had record ratings because of something that you can actually Google this yourself. It's called the Trump effect. People have been so afraid of Donald Trump and the Trump administration that they have stayed glued to the news media like never before, and ratings have been sky high because people have been afraid. Because fear motivates people to stay glued to their TV so that they can get information to find out, what do I need to do so I can survive? Because we all have that natural survivor instinct. So do you see how this is symbiotic? Okay. So, again, I want to invite people who are hearing what I'm having to say, before you dismiss it, begin to look up some of these things for yourself, because nothing that I'm saying here is conspiracy theory or anything like that. This is, I've heard it from the horse's mouth, for lack of a better term. So the article goes on and says moral panics arise when distorted mass media campaigns are used to create fear, reinforce stereotypes, and exacerbate pre-existing divisions in the world, often based on, wait for it, race, ethnicity, and social class. What do we see in 2020? This is not 1968, right? This is not 1964. This is the year 2020. You would think by now that we would be beyond being divided based on something as trivial as the color of your skin. And yet here we are, with Black people hating white people and vice versa, and all of these clashes that are happening in the streets. There's more division now in the year 2020, and society is being destabilized based on this fear that is running rampant through all these people. And you say, well, they're not afraid, they're angry. Well, what do you think the root cause of anger is? The root cause of anger is fear. The root cause of every negative emotion is fear. Go study that for yourself. You know, somebody said to me once, well, if somebody is a jerk and does something wrong at work and I'm angry, you know, that he's not getting any consequences, that's not fear, that's anger. And I said, well, actually, you're afraid that he's not going to receive consequences for his or her behavior. And so that turns into anger towards that person, and possibly the supervisors who are allowing them to get away with that. And then it was like, oh, touche. So this is all part and parcel. It goes on and it says, additionally, moral panics have three distinguishing characteristics. Let's look at those three characteristics, and we're going to wrap up soon. First, there is focused attention on the behavior, whether real or imagined. See, that's key, right? There is focused attention on the behavior, whether real or imagined. Doesn't even have to be true. This particular group doesn't even have to be actually guilty of what you're accusing them of. Just focus on them and say they're doing something or they represent something. It says there is focused attention on the behavior, whether real or imagined, of a certain certain individuals or groups that are transformed into what Cohen referred to as folk devils by the mass media. That's very important, that term folk devils. This is accomplished when the media strip these folk devils of all favorable characteristics and apply exclusively negative ones. So let's take our example that we used earlier, for lack of a better example, of sort of COVID-19 and the pandemic. You hear a lot of negative talk about quote unquote anti-maskers. And so what that is it's people who maybe don't feel the need to wear masks as frequently as other people, or some not at all. Now, whether I agree with that or not is besides the point. I believe that everybody should be safe and responsible, but there are some people who really don't feel it's necessary to wear a mask everywhere they go. You know, in the United States of America, under the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights, they have that right. But because they are being targeted by the mainstream media as folk devils and causing sort of this hysteria, you now see this intense hatred of anybody who does not acquiesce or go along with the mandates, the mask mandates and things like that, to the point where people are being violently attacked for not wearing masks, where people are being verbally assaulted in very aggressive and abusive ways in stores, outside of stores. It doesn't matter. Why? Because people they hear this stuff about quote unquote anti-maskers, and then they see one out in the street or in a store or something like that, and they say, you're the reason why we're in this situation, and they become enraged and they attack them. Now, I'm applying that to this particular situation. And again, I'm not saying one side's right or one side's wrong. I'm just saying, here's what's happening, okay? Now, this can be applied to many different situations, because what's happening? People are afraid and their fear is being weaponized. Okay. The second way, or the second characteristic of moral panic, is that there is a gap between concern over a condition and the objective threat that it poses, right? In other words, typically the objective threat, the actual realistic, logical, pragmatic threat, is far less than popularly perceived due to how it's presented by the authorities, right? So, for example, we seldomly talk about the 99.98% recovery rate of this particular situation. We instead focus on other things. And why? I don't know for sure, but it sure seems to fall in line with this stuff. I'm going to have to go on record and say I am not a medical doctor. So there are many of you who might find this unfortunate, this example that I'm using. First thing that comes to mind, I try to look at things objectively and try to make my own decisions based on that. But one thing I will not be is I will not be manipulated into fearing anyone or any group by the mass media, state officials, or local authorities so that I'm carried along with the tide of fear into doing, saying, or thinking or feeling something that is against my own self-interest. Third distinguishing characteristic of a moral panic is that there's a great deal of fluctuation over time in level of concern over a condition. So the typical pattern begins with the discovery of the threat, followed by a rapid rise and then peak in public concern, which then subsequently and often abruptly subsides. Again, for lack of a better example, I'm gonna have to go back to coronavirus, right? If you looked at what was happening prior to the summer, it was just, emergency level, 10 out of 10 level fear going on for months, right? Don't go outside, don't gather together, don't be closer than 6 feet, socially distance, this and that. And it was nonstop. I mean, this was all that was on the news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then something happened. George Floyd was murdered by a group of Minneapolis police. And after his death, there came mass riots, not just in Minneapolis, but all over the country. And what you saw people rioting, you saw people marching, and you saw people not socially distancing, not wearing a mask. And you know what else happened? The issue of COVID-19 and the coronavirus just disappeared. It just abruptly disappears. And I remember asking my wife, where's all the COVID-19 news? Where's all the COVID-19 hysteria that's being ratcheted up every day? How is it that this just disappears? And it's to the point where politicians were actually coming out and saying, despite the dangers that gathering together pose, this is more important. So it's very strange. I mean, and I'm asking you to look at this objectively. Now I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'm just going to say a couple things more. But here it says, finally, public hysteria over a perceived problem often results in passing legislation that is highly punitive, unnecessary, and serves to justify the agendas of those in positions of power and authority. Again, problem, reaction, solution. Moral panic can be both public, is a both public and a political response to any threat posed to a society by some sort of allegedly harmful individual or group. And more specifically, moral panic is typically an exaggeration, includes an exaggeration of certain events by enhancing the empirical criteria that some of the numbers, involved, and the level and extent of the violence and the amount of damage caused. It's always made a little bit worse than it actually is because you need to kind of ratchet up the fear, and that's what sells, and that's what gets people to go along with the whole Hegelian dialectic. Cohen says here, he says, of course, this is not something that happens spontaneously, but rather is a result of complex dynamics and interplay among several social actors. As originally explained by Cohen, at least 5 sets of social actors are involved in moral panic. These include 1, folk devils; 2, rule or law enforcers; 3, the media; 4, politicians; and 5, the public. So Again, in order to be able to carry out mass panic, what you need is you need to really be able to ratchet up fear. And okay, I got a little bit more time. All right. You need to be able to you need to be able to ratchet up the fear. And you need to be able to weaponize that fear. That is how you get people to go against their own self-interest. That is how you get people to go against their own morals. That's how you get people who you would never think were capable of doing a certain thing to do a certain thing. When you see somebody who is a Christian, for example, there was a group of Christians, I believe it was in Rwanda, and there was a pastor who was responsible for genocide of the, I think it was the Hutus, or I can't remember what the tribe was, but this was a Christian pastor and he was responsible for genocide. How does that happen? You see, when you take one group and you turn them into folk devils, all of a sudden that fear that is created by this narrative that these people are dangerous and scary causes you to do things to want to eliminate them. One thing that you hear, and this was one of Barack Obama's favorite sayings, he would always say that you're on the wrong side of history, or we are on the right side of history. Now, what's dangerous about that, right? Seems kind of benign at first, but when you think about that, unless you're clairvoyant and you have some sort of a crystal ball, there's no way of you telling who was on the right or the wrong side of history. You see? You can only know who was on the quote unquote wrong or right side of history by looking back in retrospect. Hindsight is 2020, and we understand life going backwards. So how in the heck can you ever point to some group that disagrees with you and say, you're on the wrong side of history? You can't do that. You absolutely cannot do that. I hope you guys like my Barack Obama impression. You absolutely cannot do that. And even after the event occurs and we look back in retrospect, we still sometimes can disagree who was on the right or wrong side of history. So it's very dangerous for us to point to a group of individuals and say they're on the wrong side of history, because what that does is psychologically, it then justifies our mistreatment of that group of people or folk devils, as we talked about. So if we begin to hate them, if we begin to abuse them, if we begin to attack them, if we begin to assault them, if we begin to kill them, it's okay, because we are morally and intellectually superior to them. We're on the right side of history. They're on the wrong side of history. And, frankly, they're folk devils and they need to be rooted out because they are a scourge to this society. You see how that works? This is what happened in Nazi Germany with the Jews. This is what has happened time and time again with people who are innocent. And you turn a blind eye to that. You think, what does this have to do with me? Well, guess what? Whatever group you belong in, it's coming to your doorstep unless you do something about it. And what you can do is you can make a choice to not go along with the panic. I know many people who are watching this might not be Christians, but I do like to refer to the Bible periodically because there is some incontrovertible truth in the pages of that book, whether you are a Christian or not. And one of my favorite quotes in the entire Bible is found in the book of John, chapter 8, verse 32, where Jesus says, "The truth shall make you free." I cannot think of something more poignant, more powerful, and more incontrovertible than that statement right there. Because why do they use fear? Why do they create moral panic in this Hegelian dialectic problem reaction solution philosophy? The reason why they do this is because they can imprison you in a cage of fear and have you go along with whatever they want. But here comes somebody with a big mouth like me, sharing the truth, exposing their philosophies and techniques and their psychological manipulation of the public, and all of a sudden that's blown up. And so what do? They fact check your tweets, they fact check your Facebook page, and maybe they'll just deplatform you. You know why? Because now the truth teller has become dangerous. Why did Jesus have to be killed? Because Jesus was telling a truth that was undoing the power that the Pharisees held over the minds of the people. He was breaking their psychological manipulation. And so they had to get rid of him, right? But there's a author by the name of George R. Martin. He's famous for writing books, a series of books, Game of Thrones, I think it's what it's called. But I believe one of the characters, I've never watched it, but one of the characters said this, and I found this just randomly on the internet one day, and this is one of my favorite quotes. It says, "When you tear out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You are only telling the world that you fear what he might say." You see, what they fear, what these powerful people fear, is they fear the truth, because you know what the truth does? The truth sets the populace free. It sets minds free. It breaks the mental chains that are put on our minds by a steady diet of the poison that comes from the mainstream media. And all of a sudden you're looking around and saying, hey, why do I have to be afraid of that? Why do I have to go along with your narrative? As a matter of fact, why are you even in power? You're supposed to represent me, and you're doing anything but representing my interests. And now their power becomes very, very shaky. You see, Gavin Newsom, who is the governor of California, has been acting like an absolute despot over the last 10 months. And what's happening now? Gavin Newsom and his team are very afraid that Gavin Newsom is going to be recalled and that he's going to lose his governorship. And the reason why is because the people are starting to wake up to the truth. At first, when he said, this is what we have to do, we're going to do this statewide lockdown, and you're not going to be able to leave your house, and there's going to be curfew, people said, yes, please, Lord Gavin, please save us, right? Take our freedom. I've never seen people just so willingly hand over their freedom before in all my life. I never thought it was possible. And yet here I am watching it in absolute, complete, just shock. I was dumbfounded. And then what happened? Time. People started seeing the discrepancies. Oh, wait, hold on. COVID is dangerous, but it's not dangerous when we're doing something that furthers your agenda, like rioting, looting, burning things down. Then it's okay. That's not a problem. COVID is dangerous unless you want to go to the French Laundry with a bunch of rich donors and have $1,000 plate meal. COVID is dangerous unless you want to get together and party with your family. So people are starting to see the hypocrisy and going, maybe I'm missing some information there. Maybe I'm not getting the whole truth. And all of a sudden they get the truth, and poof, the chains start to fall off. And then they turn and they look at Lord Newsom and they say, oh, really now? And now he's in trouble. You see how this works? Do you see how they keep you in the prison of fear? And so what we have to do is we have to make a commitment to the truth. We have to make a commitment that we are going to search for the truth daily. You know, in the Bible, in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 17, verse 11, it talks about these group of people that were from the city called Berea. And it said that the Bereans were more noble than the people that were in the city of Thessalonica, because they searched the scriptures with all readiness of mind daily to see, they received the scriptures that were preached to them with all readiness of mind, and searched the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. Right? They didn't just throw something out because they didn't believe that the person was credible. They accepted everything. Then they studied everything out, they threw away the bad and kept the good, and that's how they arrived at the truth. And that is how you can arrive at the truth, because otherwise you are going to be caught up in a cage of lies, a cage of fear, and your fear is going to be weaponized against you. And you're going to end up doing, saying, and thinking and feeling things that you never would have before. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to go that route, and I don't want to live that life. And I certainly don't think many of you do either. So I really do hope that you guys enjoyed this talk about the dangers and the weaponization of fear. If you think that any of this is nonsense, that's fine. That's okay. What I would invite you to do is go and study the subject for yourself, because what you will find is that it's even deeper than what I was able to share during this time.